My name is Randy Lubin. It's great to see you all here. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces who've been here the first 2 days, so it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming back. A quick disclaimer I do in front of all my talks. I tend to get really excited when I talk about these things, and when I get excited, I start talking really quickly. Tell me to slow down. Like, wave your hands and be like, Randy, slow down. So that's disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two is I use all sorts of jargon and weird terms from San Francisco and Silicon Valley that I forget that, like, are not normal. So if I say something and you don't know the term, please raise your hand, because odds are that everyone else here has the same question. So don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask for clarification. And don't hesitate to interrupt me with questions throughout the entire talk. So first, a little bit about me. Again, apologize to people who've already heard this twice before. But so I moved out to San Francisco Bay Area 5 years ago for grad school. I got my MBA from Stanford Business School. And while I was there, I studied as much technology and entrepreneurship as possible. It was a blast. I did a lot of consulting gigs for local startups, too, while I was in school. And after school, while I was in school, also toward the end, I started teaching myself to code, which is something that's amazing and powerful and really fun, something I recommend all of you learn, even if you don't plan to be the main technical founder. And after school, I kept teaching myself to code, I kept consulting with startups, and I was working on my own startup ideas. Ultimately, I ended up joining one of my clients, a company called Meetings.io that does real-time video chat. I joined them as the COO, which in practice meant the business guy, doing everything from working with investors and lawyers to marketing and PR to you name it. I was doing it. And I was also doing some code too, so that the amazing co-founders could stay focused on the really hard technical parts of running a video site. Anyway, after I joined full-time, we were able to quickly grow to about 200,000 users, and we started getting interest for acquisition. We launched into a really in-depth negotiations process, which I'll be talking about a little bit throughout the talk today. And we ended up selling to a company called Jive Software, which does collaboration tools for really big companies, Fortune 500 companies. And so it was a really fun negotiation. And afterwards, I stuck around at Jive. I spent a few months doing product management for my old team, helping with the transition. And then I switched over to corporate development within Jive, where I was helping out with acquisitions, partnerships, and long-term strategy. About a year ago, I got restless. I missed startup life, so I quit Jive. And since then, I've been working on fun projects. I have been advising and consulting startups. I've been traveling around teaching, and I'm also evaluating my own startup ideas now, hopefully going to launch into another startup soon. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to do a quick show of hands about you. So who is currently actively working on a startup of their own? All right, awesome. And how many people have already launched the rough version of the product that's already out there? All right, excellent. And how many of you have already had some good negotiations experience or situations where you've had to negotiate hard in the context of the business? Okay, not too many hands yet. So I've caught you at a good time. So I'll be able to hopefully give you lots of tips and tricks that will help you out. So today's talk, I'm going to cover really briefly why negotiation skills really matter, why it's great that you've shown up here and should continue to hone your negotiation skills. I'm going to go over certain things that are very explicitly not covered in this talk and why. And then we'll go through a bunch of terms and tactics. So first off, as far as why negotiations matter, negotiations are everywhere in life, but especially in startups. You're going to be negotiating when you're hiring over salary and other compensation terms. You're going to be negotiating with potential partners, with potential investors, and if you're lucky, potential acquirers, or if you go public, then I guess you'll always be negotiating with your board or with shareholders. So there's constant opportunity to be negotiating and to be thinking strategically about your interactions when you're negotiating. Negotiations can often be really high stakes, where clever tactics can end up making a huge difference, where the right amount of a few extra hours of research or a few extra hours of strategy and planning can have a massive impact on years or possibly years of future work or relationships. So it's one of those opportunities where just that extra bit of strategy and tactics can go a really long way. And finally, negotiations is really fun. At least I think so. And because negotiations, when done right, is an exercise in creativity and in empathy, where you're really working to understand the people you're working with and also come up with really fun, creative options. And options, we're going to be talking a lot about options today, but just the creative process of coming up with new terms to throw in, new clever ways of framing things and de-risking things and helping both parties achieve what they really want to get out of it. I think it's a blast. It's a really fun process, and it's something that as you get more comfortable with, hopefully you'll really enjoy too. Some things that are very specifically not covered. So I'm not going to do too much about specific persuasion tactics. They can be really important, both for you to use, also to be aware of for people using on you. But there's a huge body of work on it, and it also tends to be a little more adversarial in nature. This talk is going to be very much about treating the person you're negotiating with or the company you're negotiating with as a partner, as someone who, you're trying to both generate a lot of value together. So I won't be covering persuasion that much, but two great resources. There's a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. This is the classic book on influence, and I highly recommend reading it. It's an easy read with lots of good tips. And then if you go to the Wikipedia page, on the list of cognitive biases, there's a long list of different ways that our brains have evolved that work really well most of the time and absolutely fail us in certain situations. And I won't be talking about most of these biases, but they're really good, again, to be aware of for your own protection and maybe to use sometimes. I'll be bringing up one of these biases later in the talk called anchoring because it's just so relevant, but otherwise you can just find it online. Other things I'm not covering, I'm really not going to talk much about zero-sum negotiation, and zero-sum negotiation is simply when you're arguing over something that anything that one person gets in their favor is a clear loss of the same amount to the other party. So the classic example, well, I'll get to that on probably the next slide. And finally, I'm not going to talk about bad faith negotiation. And bad faith negotiation is when you don't really trust the person you're negotiating with, when you think they're really trying to harm you or do you wrong. And it's because it's a different style of negotiating and hopefully something you'll be able to avoid in general. If it looks like a negotiation with a partner is going to be bad faith, then you probably want to do everything you can to just get out of that situation. Because as you are all aware, doing a startup is hard, and you want to surround yourself with as many potential partners and teammates as you can that really are aligned. And if you don't have alignment, it's probably going to result in massive headaches down the road, even if it looks like it makes sense in the short term. So I won't be talking about bad faith. All right, so the first topic I want to bring up is there are two styles of negotiations. The technical terms are integrative versus distributive. And this comes back to zero-sum versus non-zero sum. So in zero-sum, it's, again, I win, you lose kind of thing, where you're just very, very clearly, like, one person's benefit is exactly to another person's detriment. And so when talked about, the usual metaphor is talking about it in terms of, is there a fixed pie that you're carving up pieces of the pie and just trying to see who can get the most pie? Or are you working together to grow the pie and make sure that there's even more benefit, more value available for everyone? And so again, so zero-sum is just carving up a pie and it's win-lose, whereas integrative or non-zero-sum is win-win. And so whenever possible, be thinking about how you can make things win-win. So just to make things clear, a quick example of zero-sum or distributive negotiation might be if you're at some street vendor and you're haggling and negotiating over, say, a scarf. Then you're just trying to negotiate the price down as much as possible, and they're trying to negotiate it up, and that's just like a bad situation. I mean, it could be fun. I enjoy haggling from time to time, but it's not nearly as much of an art form or as pleasurable an experience or beneficial an experience as if you're trying to make the pot bigger for everyone. So one of the things you can always try and do is turn zero-sum negotiations into non-zero-sum negotiations, and I'll give you another example. So a few months back, I was in Nepal, and a friend and I were negotiating over some pashmina and cashmere scarves. And normally that's a very zero-sum sort of activity, but we started bringing up, we'll be using tactics that we'll talk about a little later in this talk, but we started negotiating and doing things like, oh, well, if we buy a few extra scarves, or if we decide to upgrade the quality of the scarves, then will you give us a better deal? So suddenly it wasn't just about negotiating one scarf, where we were just clearly arguing over dollar amounts, but suddenly we're saying, oh, maybe we'll be able to give you more business overall, and that felt, again, it felt less confrontational, and I think ended up in a much better outcome for both my friend and I who were buying the scarves, as well as for the vendor. Anyway, so first we're going to be talking about, the first step for negotiations is really understanding yourself and your own position, and so I'll talk about a few ways that comes out here. So first thing you need to do is really figure out what your interests are. When you're negotiating, it's very common to fall into a trap of like finding a position. And so interests versus positions are going to come up in a little bit, but the way I'm defining it, so an interest is what really deep down matters to you and what you want to affect the outcome, and a position is just one given ask. So it could be, if you're trying to create a partnership, maybe you're talking about revenue share, a position might be, oh yeah, I want 5% of all business that goes through this partnership. And so that's about a position, but the interest there is I want to make sure that I share in the upside of this partnership and that I really benefit. So again, starting by figuring out what your interests and what really matters to you. So if you're doing if you're hiring and you're negotiating over the compensation package, knowing, it might be that cash matters most to you because you haven't raised much funding yet and you're trying to extend your runway as long as possible, then one of your main interests there is keeping salary low. But also another interest is going to be making sure the employee is properly motivated. So that's much more important than being anchored to a specific salary figure or equity figure. Another important concept is reserve price. The term reserve price is used to indicate what's the lowest term you're willing to accept in negotiation before you walk away. And this is really important to know because as a negotiation drags on, it could be that the best offer you get is one that's just bad overall and is on the whole going to make you worse off. And so if before you even go into negotiation, you sit down and say, what's the lowest offer we're willing to accept, write it down on paper or work with your co-founders to figure out what that is, then you're in a really good position down the road because if the negotiation goes bad, you can feel confident walking away. And it's important to write that first because as negotiations go on, you become really tied to the people you're talking to and really invested in the negotiation in general. And so what was the reserve price to start with, you might suddenly start saying like, oh, well, maybe there are all these other benefits and I should still go through with it. And if you haven't really committed to reserve price in advance, it's easy to fall into that trap. But if you are really explicit in terms of knowing when to walk away, you're going to avoid some bad negotiations and some bad deals. There's a term related to reserve price called BATNA. It's an acronym that stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And BATNA is the key to a lot of negotiations. And BATNA is all about, what else can I get instead if this falls through? So as opposed to the reserve price is like, what's the absolute worst before I run away? This is about what's the best other option. And unlike reserve price, which might not change, BATNA is something that you can very directly affect. So when you're preparing to go into negotiations, one, you want to understand what your general BATNA is. So for example, if you're going to hire someone, you're thinking about hiring someone, but they're negotiating really hard on salary, if you have interviewed a bunch of other candidates that you think are also good, then you have a really strong BATNA. And again, what BATNA allows you to do is avoid taking a bad or suboptimal deal because you know that there's a really good option awaiting you next door. So a key part of negotiations, it happens away from the table, happens away from the actual conversation you're having with the people you're negotiating with, and it's about generating awesome options. And that could be other partnerships. In the case of hiring, it's maybe having some contract workers standing by to be able to jump in if the negotiation falls through, or having other great candidates. If you're negotiating an acquisition, like we did with Meetings.io, it's about talking to lots of different potential acquirers at the same time. But it's also, so another thing we were doing during the acquisition is, we were in parallel talking to investors. So we're talking to potential acquirers trying to get a really good deal, but we're talking to investors about raising a new round so that if we were getting a lot of pushback on the term price for the acquisition, we could easily say, well, we're no pressure to close right now. We have some investors waiting by, and we take a lot more money. And then if you don't close the deal now, we're going to get a bit more expensive because our valuation is going to go up. And so always be looking for generating other options. So this is, again, as I said, options are going to be a recurring theme of this talk. But anytime you're generating options, both options in terms within the negotiation and better options in case the negotiation falls through, you're always going to be in a stronger position. So then if that first section was about knowing yourself, this next section is about knowing your partner. And you can see I've crossed out enemy because you should not be thinking about the person or the team or company you're negotiating against as an enemy. If you go in with that philosophy, you're probably going to end up with very aggressive, hostile negotiations. And that might lead to a bad start to the partnership, which could lead to trouble later on. Or it could just lead to a situation where you're fighting over a fixed pie. And yes, you might do well in terms of taking some of that pie, but you're probably missing out on a broader opportunity of creating all sorts of clever terms, creative terms that generate extra value for both you and the team you're negotiating with. So again, viewing negotiations as a partnership and a process that you're going through together is very, very important. And so of course that usually starts with building rapport, really getting to know the individual or teams that you're negotiating with. So if you're negotiating with somebody over salary or over compensation because you want to hire them, then you really want to understand their preferences and what really matters to them. And so in startups, especially when you're cash constrained, a common tactic or common strategy is to try and get that actual salary as low as possible, and then make up for it with a really nice equity grant, especially early on. And so part of that comes to really understanding the potential hire, how much money do they really need to live, to pay their rent and food and whatever travel expenses, and make sure that they have enough that they're not worried about making rent or living comfortably, but beyond that, not paying them too much surplus, but making up for it in equity. But again, this depends on your own preferences and interests. But that all happens by having lots of really good open conversations with the person you're negotiating with. If you're talking more about partnerships or acquisitions, then it's about really understanding how that partner thinks. And and this is true for both partnerships and acquisitions, really understanding what motivates that company, but also what motivates the specific team or group that you're negotiating with. Sometimes teams have very different outlooks than the overall company. But it also means understanding who are all the stakeholders involved. Who are the people that have to okay this decision, and what do they need to feel that this is a good deal, to approve the deal. So making sure that all the stakeholders are excited first means that you really understand how all the stakeholders are motivated and incentivized. And so you just do that by spending lots of time getting to know them and really making sure you understand the internal processes of the company and their incentives. So, and we talked a little bit before about interests and oppositions. This becomes especially true when you're negotiating with big companies, especially when big companies have standard sort of terms that they throw in general, and suddenly you're faced with a bunch of things you could negotiate on, and you might not know what's really important versus just sort of boilerplate standard things. So again, by spending a lot of time with the people you're working with, that will let you understand what's really important to them, and then you can push back on the areas that are less important to them. And that'll come up in a tactic that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but always making sure you're worried about the interests, not the positions, can save you from spending unnecessary time on terms that don't matter as much, or fixating on specific numbers. All right, so also, as you're going in, one of the things that really helps in a negotiation is getting data and getting comparables. And so the term comparables in this case, it means similar situations that are out there, other information that's available. So if you're hiring someone, finding out what the normal rates are for that type of position, for someone with that type of experience. And sometimes that information is available online. Oftentimes it's about calling friends or other entrepreneurs who have done a similar negotiation and figuring out, oh, where did you arrive at? What did you find in terms of traditional terms? One resource that can be really great here if you've taken investment is talking to your investors, because they see so many startups all the time. So they'll be able to really tell you, oh, yeah, our company, we've seen 3 companies that just hired someone like that, and here are the terms we resulted in. And so getting data and getting comparables are awesome for knowing what to expect, but also for having a nice, rational conversation with the person you're negotiating with. And so, again, trying to keep this I like thinking of negotiations as a way of you and the people you're negotiating with operating as a team to come out with the best outcome possible and the most fair outcome possible also. And when it's focused on fairness, then looking at outside data becomes really nice. Because you can say, it's not that, oh, I want an extra 30% above like what we're talking about. It's like, oh no, we looked around and it looks like the standard rates really are 30% higher, and we just want to do the right thing and do the fair thing. And so that attitude, that approach can be very, very helpful, and also takes a lot of the emotion out of the negotiations and keep it very logical and rational. Another key thing is knowing the levers. In negotiations, oftentimes, the focus comes in on just a few key terms, but always being able to take a step back and say, what other levers can we pull? What other kind of terms and options can we throw in to make this an interesting deal, an interesting offer? And this is really helpful because sometimes the team you're negotiating with is really anchored to or really constrained in some of the key terms, and they just aren't flexible. But if you can come in and surround it with lots of other interesting terms, then you can end up getting a really great deal that otherwise you might have had to walk away from. I'll give you a specific example here from my own life. So in my consulting life, I'll sometimes work with startups that are pretty cash constrained and can't afford my normal consulting rate. And usually it's fairly futile, fairly useless to try and push back hard on the actual consulting rate. But multiple times now I've come up with creative ways of adding an additional compensation. So one way I did that was getting a bit of a convertible note, which was the same vehicle that the investors were using to get their equity stake. So part of my compensation was going to be through the convertible note, and the rest was just through cash. But you can always look for extra ways of extra terms, extra leverage to pull to make the deal more interesting for you, and to get around certain obstacles that the other party might not be able to budge on. There's another term it's a weird term called log rolling. I'll explain the origin of the term in a second, but first I'll explain what it means. So log rolling refers to when you and the people you're negotiating with have different values of the different terms involved. So things might be more important to you than to them, and vice versa. And log rolling means that you're trading off things you care less about for things they care more about. And log rolling is some of the key core bits of negotiation that allow you to have win-win scenarios. So it might be that, like, let's say there are five key terms in a negotiation, and I really care about terms 1 and 3, and the partner I'm negotiating with really cares about 2 and 4. I should be really happy giving up a lot on terms 2 and 4 in order to increase 1 and 3, and they should be happy with the same, and we're both going to walk away a lot happier having done that. And so again, anytime you can tease out what matters a lot to them and not to you, and the reverse, really try and negotiate both of those at the same time. And this gets to a point which I'll be reiterating later, in that you should never be negotiating one term at a time, because when you negotiate things one term at a time, it's easy to revert to just zero sum again. So let's say you're doing a salary negotiation. If you're just talking about actual cash without also talking about equity or talking about benefits and other terms, then again, it's I win, you lose. An extra $1,000 in salary for them is $1,000 less for you. So log rolling, again, allows you to put in multiple terms at once and remove the feeling of zero sum. The origin of log rolling, real quick, comes to, I believe, in Maine, which is a state in northeast United States. There used to be these teams of loggers who would chop down trees, and it was really dangerous. And you'd have these rival camps all working, and they pretty much wouldn't talk to each other, wouldn't help each other out, except when it came to moving these giant trees onto, I think, barges, maybe trucks, which was so dangerous that everyone would come together and help each other out. And so they were rolling the logs together, and everyone was benefiting because no one team could do it on their own. So again, coming back, always to be thinking about options. The options are important for log rolling because adding new terms, whenever you're adding new terms, new levers to pull, new options, allows more things where you and the person you're negotiating with have different preferences. And anytime you have different preferences, you have the opportunity to create even more win-win situations. Another thing you can do that's really useful to build in is thinking of contingencies. So oftentimes, if you're dealing with fairly simple terms, some terms might be inflated not because they're the fair price, but because the person you're negotiating with might have fears of what happens when things go wrong. And so you might be able to tease out better terms for the high-level main terms if you build in really good contingencies for what happens in scenario A or B or C. So when we were negotiating the Meetings.io acquisition, one of the things as we were teasing out the interests, they were very worried about extra risk exposed because we were violating possibly a patent or a copyright somewhere in the process of creating the company. And we knew we were in the clear from that, and what we were worried about is patent trolls. And are people familiar with patent trolls? Quick show of hands. Yeah, somewhat. So for those of you who aren't, patent trolls are a phenomenon in the US, I'm not sure if they're a phenomenon globally, where people happen to own a patent, but they actually aren't doing any business around it, and they solely exist to sue people who might be using those patents. And in the US, at least, there are some really bad patents that have been given out, things that are really obvious and broad, such as, basically being able to upload a file by dragging it from the desktop into the browser. That shouldn't be patented. That's something that is fairly evident, fairly obvious as a mechanism, and yet that patent exists, and it's possible for any company that's using it to be sued, even though lots of companies are using it. So anyway, we were concerned that some patent troll was going to come around that that actually might not have been right, that we might not have even been violating the patent, but they might just be suing to try and get us to settle to avoid paying lawyer fees. So we didn't want to get in trouble for that, and Jive didn't want to get in trouble because we had sneakily stolen some technology and not disclosed that. And so we built contingencies into the contract which covered both of our respective fears. And because of that, I think we were able to get better valuation overall because they weren't building into the price the possibility that, that they were going to have to pay a lot of legal fees or pay out to patent trolls. So again, building contingencies comes from understanding what are your partner's fears and what are their incentives and how might things go wrong. And when you couple that with having confidence and knowledge about your own position and your own expectations about the future of your business, you can build in contingencies which really make everyone confident. It's also really nice putting contingencies because they really spell out expectations for how the partnership's going to evolve. This is one of those things that isn't really as relevant to negotiations, but just to general good business practices. And it's true whether you're talking about setting expectations with your employees or setting expectations with a potential acquirer or partner or investor. And these are the kind of things that if you cover them up front, if you spell them out, you can avoid a lot of headache and a lot of tension down the road. So and this is a more specific tactic, and it's around using an agent. And when I say using an agent, I mean that very vaguely. So it could be that you're just using one of your employees to do the negotiation and that the CEO or the founder isn't necessarily at the table. And the tactic there is if you're sending one of your employees to go do some of the negotiating, then they can always say, this sounds really good, but give me a sec, I need to go back and check with the boss. And that helps buy time and also removes a bit of the emotion from the negotiations because it's not that you're saying no, it's saying, oh, let me just check because the team might have some issues. So again, if you're a founder, if you're out doing the negotiation but your whole team is not with you, you can say, this sounds really great, but I need to check with my team. And that's a good way of buying extra time. Anchoring is one of those cognitive biases I mentioned earlier, and it's the only one I'm really going to talk about today. And so anchoring refers to the fact that the first number or first terms thrown out tend to anchor the conversation in that they pull the entire conversation around it, and oftentimes terms don't move all that far from where they start. And so this is the kind of thing where if you're trying to be sneaky or malicious, you can try and anchor really, really low, but the danger there is that you insult the partner and then it switches the tone to more of a zero-sum adversarial negotiation. But it's still something to think about, and even if you're not talking about anchoring specific terms, it's good to think about in terms of anchoring the conversation the way it will unfold, because where you start off in terms of talking about the negotiation has a huge impact in terms of the path that the negotiation takes. And going back to also setting expectations, if you can come in and say, we're thinking about a deal that is more of a revenue share kind of thing, and here are terms we're interested in, even if you're not bringing out specific numbers, it will set a very different path for the negotiation than saying, hey, we would love a huge fixed amount up front and just a contract that will last a year or two, as if you're doing a partnership. And so again, coming in and with sort of your way of looking at the world and your way of looking at where the negotiation might go can really set the tone for where the negotiation will go and hopefully end up with a favorable outcome for you, where otherwise you might spend a lot of time far away from the negotiation point that you want to reach. I want to talk also about things to avoid. So we already talked a little bit about piecemeal negotiations, which is negotiating just one term at a time. And so I'll reiterate, whenever possible, you want to negotiate a lot of terms simultaneously. You want to try and negotiate the whole contract so that it's not adversarial, you can get the win-wins. You also want to avoid deal fatigue. This is something that can be really sneaky, can sneak up on you. So deal fatigue refers to if you're negotiating something over a long period of time, everyone can just sort of get tired of working on the deal. This is especially true if you're working with big teams where you're in the nitty-gritty, you're negotiating not the most important terms, but some of the ones further down. And after a week or two of just really hard digging into the details and understanding the interest, people start getting tired. So you always want to make sure you're maintaining a good cadence of the deal, because it could get to a point where there's deal fatigue and people are just rushing to close the deal, and then you get a suboptimal outcome for everyone. Or it could be that people just get tired and they say, I'm not sure if this is actually going to happen, and they walk away. So making sure you're moving forward on a good schedule helps with that, and also making sure you're only really pushing on the issues that matter most to you. So even though there might be 30 different terms to negotiate on, if you identify the 5 that are most key and focus on those, and say on the others, let's just make sure it's ballpark, pretty fair, that could be a good way of avoiding deal fatigue too. But it comes with really feeling confident in these terms matter, these terms don't. Another thing to avoid is called the sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost fallacy refers to overvaluing work or money that's already been paid that you won't be able to get back. So for example, this could be in terms of time or in terms of money. So if you've spent 2 weeks negotiating a deal, you then feel pressure to do that deal just because you've spent 2 weeks. I have to just get it done because I've already put in so much time. And you shouldn't think of it that way. At any given time, you should step back and look at all your options as if it was a clean start. And so just because you spent a bunch of time, or maybe even spent money prototyping a relationship or prototyping channels, doesn't mean you should feel committed to going through with it. And again, this comes to a lot of trying to be self-aware about your current terms and your other options, and making sure you're always keeping legitimate other options that you can turn to. There's a flip side to sunk cost fallacy, so that you shouldn't treat the work that you've already done as absolutely nothing, because it could mean that you can get a deal done faster or better because you have put in the time. You just have to be aware of not doing something just because you've invested in it already. And that's another thing that can really help you from committing to bad deals that you shouldn't otherwise when you have other good options available. The final main thing to avoid is just decision-making in real time. When you're sitting down with the person you're negotiating with, emotions can definitely come in, and you can either get really excited or really greedy or really fearful, and that can lead you to make snap decisions that are suboptimal or not in your best interest. So it's always good to say, this sounds great, let me sleep on it, or this sounds really good, let me go talk to my partners or my founding team. And anytime you can say, this is awesome, but let's just take a little bit of time, really, really effective at taking a step back and saying, is this really the best deal? Are there other good options out there? Am I taking this deal because I'm really excited about the people I'm working with, or because it actually makes sense for the company overall? And this is something, again, you can encourage the other side to do too. Because I've seen situations where, so this actually just happened a few weeks ago, where I was talking with a company, they were interested in having me join their team, and we just had like a really awesome time hanging out the first time we hung out, and the second time we hung out, and they were like, okay, here's your offer. And I was like, whoa, slow down. I know you're really excited about this, but let's take a step back. Let's make sure we have a good process in place to make sure we really have the right expectations, and that it's going to work out in the long run. I didn't end up accepting it, partly because we took the time to really explore and see if it actually made sense as a good opportunity for all of us. And it turned out that as we dug through the details, it didn't. So those are some key things to avoid. Wait, I just go in the wrong direction. Okay, we talked about anchoring. So again, this is the last bit of the prepared slides, but I have a bit more I want to talk about with you. But always be thinking about options. I say that's one of the main themes of this talk, and I really believe in it, that anytime you can get creative, come up with extra options. Again, options that are BATNA, that increase your BATNA and increase what will happen if the deal falls through, are great because then you don't feel pressure to take a bad deal, but also options within deals that allow you to grow the pie even more and get even better outcomes for you and the people you're negotiating with. So always be thinking about options. And that's it for the main talk. I'm happy to take questions on the topics that we talked about now. I'm also happy to take questions about specific negotiations that are on your mind, or negotiations that might come up in the near future. That might be useful, because I've seen negotiations now in a lot of different contexts, and it might be useful for everyone if we talk about it live here. Sure. So the question was, can I elaborate more on sunk cost fallacy? So again, sunk cost fallacy is all about not making a decision or making a deal because of the time and energy you've already put into it, but at any given point reevaluating and saying, okay, as of right now, what are my different options out there? So let's come up with a good example. So when we're doing the acquisition, we had our reserve price and our BATNA in mind, but there was a point where we had spent tons of weeks talking with Jive and with their team, and talking with our lawyers and their lawyers, and we were getting close to closing the deal. And at that point, if they had come in and tried to lowball us and change a lot of the terms in the other direction, we may have been tempted to take it because we had invested so much time and energy, and starting again with somebody else would take months of time and lots of legal bills. And so at that point, we could have fallen. So they didn't end up lowballing us, but if that situation easily could have happened, and then we would have to say, let's just not take this deal because it's the deal on the table. Let's actually see, do we think we can get better deals elsewhere, even though they're not immediately available. Trying to think if I can come up with another example to sort of triangulate an unsunk cost fallacy. This is an example that isn't actually relevant to negotiations, but let's say you're busy building your product and you decided to start by building it with, let's say you're using Bootstrap. Do people know what Bootstrap is? It's a framework for front-end design that goes into your HTML and CSS and allows you to easily generate beautiful pages. So let's say you spend a week building your website using Bootstrap, and then you realize, you know what, I want to do some really sophisticated, complex things that Bootstrap doesn't allow. Then you might be faced with the situation of like, okay, do I spend all the extra time trying to make it work within Bootstrap, which might be a huge headache and a lot of training and learning that could go elsewhere? Or do I end up restarting and building it in a completely different framework that might be better suited? Well, sunk cost fallacy might at that point lead you to say, I'm sticking with Bootstrap, even though the amount of time and energy it takes to modify it to your needs might take longer than just starting over in a new framework. So anytime you're thinking about a decision and one of the main drivers is, oh, but I spent so much time already, that should send like warning bells singing in your head that you might be falling into sunk cost fallacy. Does that answer the question? Cool. More questions?
So what if you speak to your VCs or angels and there's potential for the cake becoming big or exponential, as I want to put it, and if you go at the table and start negotiating terms, percentage equity, say we are planning to talk, we say maximum 10 to 15% for the initial seed funding, whatever you call it. But what if they want to ask for more? So how do you negotiate such a deal? What if they say 40% and you and the stakeholders, the partners are ready to give only say 10 to 15%?
Sure.
How do you handle that?
So the question is very specific to fundraising. So say you're talking to angels or to VCs, and you have in mind that you only want to give up 10, 15% of the company, and they're saying, no, we really need 40% to work. How do you negotiate that? How do you work with that? And so one of the first things, so sort of working through the concepts that we talked up here, one of the first things to do is really understand where they're coming from and what their incentives are, and why they're so fixated on 40%. So it could be that the way their portfolio and the way their investment strategy is set up is that they need these large ownership percentages in order to justify it to their LPs. And so it could be that there's something in the terms of how they work that they just have to take that much. And at that point, if that's true, you have to say, is there some world in which you're okay giving up that much equity, or does it not make sense at all? But I think this is a great time to bring in exploring different options and figuring out what are the different levers you can pull, what are the different types of things you can put into the contract. Because it could be that they're completely unwilling to budge from 40%, but there might be many other terms that are interesting. So you could say, okay, maybe we'll do 40%, but instead of giving us 100,000, we really need 800,000. And that you're doing, in that case, you might be doing your seed round and your A, or your pre-seed and your seed at the same time. Or there might be other terms around other benefits that you can get from them. Maybe they'll also help you with, maybe they have their own team of marketers that they can lend you, or their own team of engineers that you can borrow. So again, you just want to be creative in exploring other options. But at the same time, you can also, if there's a chance that they're not going to budge and you can't add in other terms that'll really help you out, this is another case of just generate as many options as possible. And if you have getting other investors who are really excited but will give you more favorable terms on the terms that matter most to you, that will really save you, being able to walk away.
Could you talk a little bit about how to deal with investors that might be micromanaging the product and pushing the company towards revenue generation when you really think it's not ready yet?
Got it. Good question, and a tough question. How do you manage investors who are trying to micromanage your company, and especially your strategy, and pushing you perhaps faster toward revenue than makes sense based on where your company's at? So managing investors, it's tricky. A lot of it is about setting the expectations up front when you take the money from the investors about how involved they'll be. Ideally, when you're working with investors, they're investing in you because they trust you as a leader, as a founder. And if they start micromanaging, you have to find ways to tactfully say, look, I appreciate your interest. I know that you're incredibly knowledgeable and have lots of background, but you have to trust me on this because I'm working with deep in the business on a day-to-day basis, and I know why and when it makes sense to really go for revenue versus other strategies. And you can have, it's helpful to have a very cogent, a very clear strategy plan written out with the logic. Because again, you're saying, look, we've done the research, we've done our homework, we deeply understand the pros and cons of going first for revenue. But in this case, we've decided that it's better to postpone it and using that. And if they, and another thing you can do to sort of protect yourself up front is whenever you're thinking about taking money from an investor, meet with many of their previous investments and see, are they the type of investor to micromanage? And oftentimes it is way better to take less money than to take from another investor than to take a lot of money from a bad investor who's going to be a huge pain in the future. So you should see that as a sort of hidden term in the negotiation when you're comparing different options, is how much extra cost is there going to be after the negotiation based on taking up your time. More questions?
If you were talking to, say, a product designer, and you're not a designer at core, and they were wanting to take some equity in the business at an early stage, if that was you, and it was your idea, and they also liked the idea, what tactics would you use to negotiate with them as to how much equity they could take in terms of what different capacities they might take on? For instance, they might say, we'll do manufacturing and cost, and we want X amount. Like, how would you negotiate? How would you navigate that kind of dilemma?
Sure. So I'll answer that as I think I understand, and please correct me if I start veering off. So I think one of the main things that can be really useful here is coming up with different options, and even before you come up with the options, doing the research and see, okay, people who are engaged in this type of design activity, how much equity is normal to give up, or perhaps how much is, if you're not giving equity, how much cash are you usually spending, and then trying to figure out what the equivalent of that cash payout is in terms of your current equity, and sort of knowing roughly what's the sliding scale between cash when it's all cash and equity within your company allows you to feel like you're paying them a fair amount. So sort of knowing in general what's the norm and what's fair is a good place to start. And then once you have that, approaching them with different clear buckets of options that are sort of different enough from each other that they can really think about their interests and what matters to them. So it could be that there are 3 possible type levels of engagement they might have, from doing a sort of one-off project to joining as someone who's working full-time, and maybe there's some things in between. And then for each of those you can present, well, in the earlier case, we're really not willing to give up much equity because you're not incentivized to stick around long-term anyway, and so maybe it's a more cash-heavy offer. And then for the latter use case, if they're joining full-time and spending all of their time making sure it works, that you get a great outcome, then perhaps equity becomes more important on the sliding scale, or as an option. So there's an interesting tactic I've seen used a few times in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, which is when you're giving an offer letter to a potential new employee saying, we have 2 ends of a spectrum of salary and equity, and so we have high salary, low equity, and low salary, high equity, and you can pick anywhere on that scale you want based on your own needs. Again, that's a way of recognizing that everyone has different incentives and helping them figure out what works best for them. Did that answer the question? Was that close?
Yeah. I think it's just tricky when you're doing business. Like if you're a tech startup and you know exactly what you want to do and you know how to build a website or the company, that's what you do.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes trickier when you're trying to be doing something that you understand what you want to do and how you're going to get there, but it's not your key strength.
Definitely, yeah, and
so that makes it so much trickier to negotiate.
Yes, and so one thing I'll call out here, which is another great tactic, is pulling in friends and colleagues and people you trust to help you with the deal. So in this case, it might be pulling in a friend who really understands how design works to help you with the right communications terms, so you're even using the right language when talking with the designer, and also understanding more about how how the designers think and act, and also even evaluating the designer's portfolio. Like this is probably possibly the most valuable as like, so I'm not a designer by training, and if I were to hire a designer, I would definitely get some of my designer friends to evaluate to make sure that they're actually a great designer. So that's another thing, whether it's design or engineering or sales, bringing in someone who is an expert is immensely valuable. And this kind of comes to a higher point of, when you're doing a startup, it's always okay to say, I don't know, I'm not the expert on the subject. Because it's not your job to be the expert on everything. It's your job to build an amazing team, whether a full-time team or just advisors and mentors who can help you out, who really have seen these patterns before and can advise you in any given situation. Cool. Question back there.
What's the maximum equity that you would give to an investor? Because there are investors asking for 40% equity.
Yeah.
Is it crazy or is it normal?
Well, so the question is, what's the maximum equity you're willing to give to an investor? And so it's always very, very context sensitive, and a lot of it's driven by market rates. 40% sounds really high to me, especially, but if they're giving you crazy amounts of money, it might make sense. So, but one thing you have to keep in mind is they're probably not the last investor you're going to work with, and that every investor is just going to dilute you more and more and more. And you don't want to end up in a place where, and you also are going to need to set aside a bunch of equity to incentivize future employees. And so you really don't want to end up in a place where suddenly all the equity has been taken away by early investors, that later investors are going to come in and say, this is really weird, we don't feel like the founding team is even incentivized to make the right decisions. So I'd be really, really careful about giving away that much, but also, there are probably situations where it's okay because either there's just so much money being added, or, maybe it's being given at such an early stage that it's so risky that it is acceptable. But other things to consider when they're asking for really that much is figuring out, is there something about where the company is at right now that is signaling to them that it's such a high-risk investment, and maybe if it's you used to have slides, or if it's just the idea pre-launch, then they're observing it and they think there's all this risk, that if you just take a month and go out and build a very broken, lightweight prototype and get some users, suddenly you can get a much better deal, so the same amount of money for much less, or a lot more money for the same amount of equity.
A real team versus outsourcing. A real team versus outsourcing to an investor. How do they react? Is it negative or positive?
So the question is, how do investors react to having a real team versus outsourcing? And so there are a few different ways that investors tend to think about it. So in general, I think investors really like awesome, well-rounded founding teams, because those teams, there are a few benefits to not outsourcing. So in general, I love seeing teams that are just doing it all in-house, that are experts on what they're trying to build and can build it themselves because of a few things. So one, it makes the feedback loops way stronger, because you build something, you're immediately getting feedback from the users, and then later that day you can roll out new updates, or later that week you can roll out new updates. And when you're using an outsourced team, it tends to really slow down the entire process. So I was advising a startup a few years back where it was two founders who were really bright, really capable. They were pretty much just business founders, although one was starting to teach himself how to code. And when they were outsourcing it, they were outsourcing it to someone who was living in San Francisco and pretty competent, so they weren't running into communications problems, which can be a problem with outsourcing. But what would happen is we launched the product, we immediately started getting feedback, and we said, okay, here's the list of features we need to change. And it took us a month to roll those features out. So for a month, we weren't getting new feedback, we were just getting the same old complaints. And so as an investor, I think I see those kind of situations as huge flags, as if they don't have product market fit yet, and if it does, they're going to move really slowly, and it's going to be a really rough journey until they have product market fit. However, so on the flip side, I've seen teams where they know exactly what needs to be built because they're such experts on the subject matter, and moreover, it's not technically challenging. They're not doing something new on a technical end. It's something that's been done a million times before that any development shop can do without thinking too much. And they've been able to successfully get that built and get it out there. And because one of the things that investors care about most, if not the most important, maybe after team, is traction. If you're able to quickly outsource the work because you don't have the ability to do the work yourself, or track the right technical co-founder, you might be able to get some really good traction early on. And if you have traction, again, none of the other stuff matters, because investors will say, okay, you've already built something people love, you already have product market fit, I'm okay with the fact that it's outsourced. There's still a trade-off, though. I've seen companies who successfully raise money, successfully launch a product, having outsourced it, that then when they decide to bring it in-house and hire their own team, they just have to hire way more engineers or spend way more time actually fixing the code base that they got from the outsourced team. That's a very common pattern, a very common trap people fall into. So again, it's, there are definitely trade-offs. Also, another thing to think about is if you have a team that's non-technical and you're going to bring on a founding engineer, you're probably going to have to give them a lot of equity. And so again, if you're doing something that isn't technically challenging, maybe then it makes sense to outsource. But I would only outsource in situations where it's something that's so clear and so easy that the outsource agencies isn't really going to can't screw it up in a big way. And even then, I'd be really careful, because if it's that easy, you might just want to take a week and teach yourself to code and do it yourself. So those are somehow I think about it, and that's, I think, also how investors tend to think about it too.
When negotiating, we need to know our reserve price, and we have options, so that we can negotiate better if you know the other party's reserve price and options. You can share any ways or tricks where we can use to know better their reserve price, their options, what they are thinking.
Sure. So the question is, what tips do I have for better arriving at what the reserve price is, and for better generating options? And so for reserve price, that can be really tough to define. So when we were doing the sale at Meetings.io, when we first got approached and first had a little bit of acquisition interest, I sat down with the founding team and explained a lot of what I just explained to you, because they hadn't had too much of formal negotiating theory. And so I said, we need to figure out what the reserve price is. We need to figure out what the minimum deal we would get that we'd be happy with. And then what we need to do is figure out, do we think it's even possible for us to get that deal? And so the first part of that was much more art than science. It wasn't like we had an easy number we can pull out of the hat. We knew a little bit of, I think what we ended up basing it on was how much of a return we can give to our investors, because we really wanted to make sure our investors felt well taken care of, because we knew that we would be founding more startups in the future and probably going back to the same investors. So we said, okay, maybe we wouldn't feel comfortable walking away unless our investors, who are all angel investors, got at least 2 or 3x return on their investment. I'm not sure if those were the exact numbers, but that was our thought process. We said that's how we came up with the reserve price. And then the question was, do we think it's actually valuable? Do we think we're actually going to hit that? And the way we got that was by talking to a lot of other startups who had gone through negotiations recently and seeing what prices were being given out for those types of startups. So to give you a little more background on the Meetings.io deal, so when acquisitions happen in the Valley, or anywhere really, they tend to be of a few certain types. So the most simple kind is a talent acquisition, where they don't care about your product, they don't care about your technology, they don't care about your audience, they just want your team. And they're probably going to just repurpose your team for existing projects within the acquirer. And those, in Silicon Valley, those deals might go for anywhere between $500,000 and $1 million, or even $2 million per engineer, assuming that you have amazing engineers, which is absolutely crazy, but that's sort of where we've arrived at. And the people doing those deals tend to be Facebook and Google and companies like that. So that's like at the low end of deals. Then as you start going up in sophistication, you get technology and product acquisitions, where they are really looking, they love the product that you've built. Maybe you haven't amassed a big audience, but they want to take your product and repurpose it, or take the underlying technology and repurpose it within the acquirer. And those deals tend to be a little bit bigger and can range from the high single millions to the tens of millions, depending on how sophisticated and complicated the product is. And then at the next level up, maybe they're buying you for your audience. Maybe you've done a really good job of taking in tons and tons of valuable users that are really loyal to you, and maybe the acquirer thinks that they can better monetize those users. So that you might be paying even more based on how valuable those users are. And then at the high end, maybe they're acquiring you because you have really strong revenue streams, and they want to repurpose the revenue streams. So understanding why the acquirer wants to buy you, and where you fit in that spectrum, and what similar deals have happened and where those are valued, ends up giving you a good sense of what their reserve price might be, and how they think about things and where they're going to come in. So again, with Meetings.io, we were trying to figure out, are they going to beat our reserve price? And looking around, our general sense was, yeah, we feel pretty confident that they're going to come in above the reserve price. And there's so once we decided that, and this is a little bit away from the question that you asked, but once we decided that, we said, okay, let's focus 100% of our time on getting an amazing outcome. And my thinking was, if we split our time between continuing to develop the product and trying to get a good acquisition, we're going to end up with mediocre progress on the product and a mediocre term sheet from the acquirer. So from the point that we committed to the process onward, we pretty much spent all of our time focused on the deal. We still worked on features a little bit, but we only worked on features that we thought would get us a better term on the acquisition. And so we changed our roadmap to fit the acquisition. And the next thing we did was talk with a ton of our friends, a ton of the people within our networks and our investors, of seeing whom might be a good acquirer, what are the terms that are most important, because none of us had done a major acquisition before, and what are the terms that are most important, and what are some of the anti-patterns, what are some of the traps to avoid. And we got some really great feedback from our investors and friends. And in terms of generating additional options, we said, okay, we sort of had a threefold approach. So we looked at companies that were going to acquire us because we threatened them. So those include WebEx and GoToMeeting, who had very professional video chat solutions that we were undercutting. And so we told an innovator's dilemma kind of story. And so we approached them. And then we also had companies that didn't do video chat yet, but that video chat might have a really nice complement to what they do. So we talked to LinkedIn and Salesforce and said, hey, our video chat might be really beneficial to your users. You might want to think about buying us for that reason. And so Jive very much was in that bucket. And then the third bucket, in terms of generating options, was just talking to investors and saying, hey, assuming this acquisition doesn't happen, are you there to continue supporting us? And that also was really good, knowing that we could walk away from the deal, and meant that even if this negotiation takes more months than we think, and we end up running low on cash, that the investors will be there to save us. And so that's how we went through that part of the strategy. Is that helpful? Okay, cool. More questions? Is that a question, or you're just yawning? Just yawning. All right. More questions? Oh, there we go.
We are a small startup, so like in my field, I'm in the field of science, so we need to get product vendors like big players, like I can give you an example like Fisher Scientific. Those are big players. How do you do a negotiation when you are like a small startup but you're trying to negotiate a deal with a big giant? So how do you go for it?
So the question is, how do you negotiate a deal when you're a small startup and your potential customer or partner is huge? So one of the first things to do in those types of situations is make sure you really understand that partner and how they think. Because odds are they have a huge number of people who are going to have to approve the deal and who all have slightly different incentives. Beyond the scope of the question is like enterprise sales strategy and partnerships, which there are a lot of great resources online for how to effectively do enterprise sales. But a lot of it comes down to understanding the incentives of the players involved and understanding, again, what levers you can pull. Because it could be that big companies might, and getting creative too, because it could be that a lot of big companies are okay paying tons of cash up front, but they want the other terms to be very solidified, or they're not willing to budge on other agreements. Otherwise, I think a lot of it comes from finding one champion within that company, one person that absolutely loves your business and loves what the partnership means, and they're going to be the ones that help circulate the idea among people within that bigger company. And so it's about really winning over that first person. Other things you can do, so you want to be careful about falling into these processes that they've established that take like 6 months and require tons of approval, and that's like lethal if you're a startup, because everything in a startup is about speed. And so anytime you can get creative in finding a workaround to those processes, whether it's, oh, let's just get a prototype, like a test pilot going up now, and we'll do that with terms that are, they're not going to be the terms that are in the permanent thing, they're just sort of an experiment. Then you jump out of the main loop with the 20 stakeholders, and now you're just dealing with 1 or 2 people. So that could be another tactic. A great thing to do here is just talk to other companies, other startups that have done partnerships with that company or companies like them, and figure out what worked for them. Because odds are, when you're dealing with big companies, that there are other startups that have dealt with them before, and hopefully you can learn from their mistakes and from their tips and tricks. I'm getting the time signal. Any last questions before we call time? All right, well, you've been a wonderful audience. I hope you've learned a bit. For those of you who've been here the past few days, it's been great seeing you again and again. I hope that this has left you a little more empowered to engage in negotiations and get better outcomes, and excited to negotiate in all sorts of different contexts. And good luck as you work on your startups, and I'm really excited to see how you succeed and where you go. So again, thank you.